She saved an Apache warrior, but what if I told you that single act of mercy would shatter her father's faith, ignite a clash between armies, and bind her destiny to a man the world called her enemy? For years, she kept her secret buried beneath sermons, storms, and silence. Yet one morning, he returned. Not as a fugitive, but as a chief, with a herd of mustangs and a vow that could either unite or destroy everything she loved. Stay with me for just one more minute, and I'll reveal how her choice, born from compassion, defied a preacher's wrath, a soldier's command, and an entire nation's hatred. And when you hear it, I want to know, how does it make you feel, knowing love could rise from blood and fire? Share your thoughts in the comments, tell me where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next story. May your day be filled with courage, hope, and a little light, just like hers. The canyon breathed like an ancient beast. Its sandstone walls rose in jagged layers of crimson and gold, shadows spilling across the floor where dry brush and twisted cottonwoods clung to life. Above, a hawk circled slow and patient, its cry echoing down the gorge like a warning. The air carried a sharp scent of dust and sage, mingled with the faint sweetness of wildflowers fighting to bloom despite the drought. Late afternoon light bled across the cliffs, painting the sky a pale orange, the kind of light that promised both beauty and danger. Sarah Jenkins picked her way along the narrow trail, her boots crunching over loose rock. At 17, she had grown up with this canyon, pressing against the edges of her life, its silence filling her childhood like a sermon. She was tall for her age, slender but strong, with sun-browned skin and hair the color of chestnut bark that caught the light when the wind lifted it from her shoulders. Her face bore no softness of girlhood anymore. Loss had carved it sharper, though her green-gray eyes still held something unyielding, something that resisted her father's strict sermons. Her father, Reverend Jedediah Jenkins, ruled their homestead with the same fire he brought to his pulpit. For him, faith was iron and punishment was mercy disguised. Since her mother's passing 2 years before, Sarah had lived under his shadow. Her mother had been gentle, teaching Sarah to stitch wounds, to brew teas from wild herbs, to see people not by the color of their skin, but by the ache in their eyes. When she died, that warmth seemed buried with her, leaving Sarah caught between two worlds, her father's rigid law and her mother's softer memory. Sarah, a boy's voice echoed faintly from above. Her younger brother Samuel, 12 and restless as the desert wind, balanced on a ridge, waving his arm. He had hair like corn silk, tangled by dust, and a grin that could charm even the grimmest ranch hand. Yet today, his voice held no laughter, only alarm. "Down there, something's moving." Sarah squinted, hand shielding her brow. The canyon floor shifted, not with brush or coyote, but with the faintest sign of life dragging itself across the gravel. Her heart stilled. She descended quickly, dust swirling around her skirts, and there, behind a fallen log blackened by lightning, lay a man. Not just any man, a young Apache warrior. His bare chest was smeared with blood, a wound darkening near his shoulder where a bullet had ripped through. His black hair spilled across the dirt, tangled with sagebrush, and his face, sharp, proud, was turned toward the sky as if daring it to strike again. He couldn't have been older than 20, yet his eyes, half-lidded with pain, burned like embers. Sarah froze. Every word her father ever preached came roaring back. "They raid our cattle. They kill without mercy. They are heathens beyond salvation." Her chest tightened. She should run. She should call Samuel. She should tell her father, let the cavalry take the body away like they always did. But she didn't move, because those eyes, dark, defiant even in the grip of death, held her. They were not begging. They were not broken. They were alive with pride. The same pride she remembered in her mother's eyes when defying Jedediah over something as simple as offering bread to a starving stranger. "Sarah," Samuel's voice was closer now, clattering down the rocks. "What is it?" Panic surged. If Samuel saw, he'd tell Jedediah, and Jedediah would kill this man where he lay. Or worse. Sarah dropped to her knees beside the warrior. His breathing was ragged, each inhale a battle, each exhale a surrender. She pressed her palm against the wound, felt the hot rush of blood seep through her fingers. He flinched, but his gaze did not waver from hers. Her lips trembled. "Don't speak," she whispered, though she doubted he understood English. Still, something in his eyes told her he did. Behind her, Samuel shouted again, closer this time. Sarah's heart hammered like a drum. She could not explain why, but a decision carved itself inside her, sharp and irreversible. She would not leave him here, not for the buzzards, not for the cavalry, not for her father's sermons. Her mind raced. There was only one place, one hidden space no one entered since her mother's passing. The old storm cellar behind the barn, boarded up but still deep and dry. "Hold on," she murmured, voice breaking with a mix of fear and resolve. "I'll get you out of here." With strength she didn't know she had, Sarah slid her arms beneath his shoulders, dragging him inch by inch from the shadow of the canyon wall. The hawk screamed above, circling tighter, as if the desert itself bore witness to her defiance. "Sarah!" Samuel's voice rang again, just beyond the ridge. She gritted her teeth, pulling the warrior behind the fallen log, shielding him from her brother's view. Dust clung to her skirt, her arms ached, but she forced herself not to falter. The Apache, Taza she would later learn, met her gaze one last time before unconsciousness claimed him. And in that fleeting glance, Sarah felt something shift inside her, the weight of her father's hatred cracking, the echo of her mother's compassion rising. Samuel stumbled down, breathless, cheeks flushed. "Was it a coyote? I thought I saw—" Sarah wiped her bloody hand against her skirt, hiding it in the folds. Her voice came calm, almost cold. "Just a rock slide. Nothing else." He squinted at her, suspicious, but too winded to press further. "Pa's waiting," he said. "Come on." Sarah forced a smile and nodded, but her heart raced as she glanced back at the shadowed log. The decision was already made. Tonight, when darkness fell, she would return. She would drag the warrior back, across the pasture, past the silent barn, and into that forgotten cellar. And if her father ever found out, it would not just be her life on the line. It would be Samuel's. It would be the entire family's. Yet Sarah knew, just as the canyon knew, that some choices are worth the risk. The wind howled like a beast, tugging at the wooden slats of the barn. Dust spiraled in the corners, as if the earth itself was trying to escape the heavy silence that had settled in the evening air. The sun, now dipping below the horizon, bled crimson light across the sky, leaving the world bathed in an eerie, dusky glow. Sarah's hands trembled as she knelt over Taza, his chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. The blood-stained bandage she had tied around his wound was already soaked, the red seeping into the fabric, a grim reminder of how fragile his life was. She had to act quickly. She could hear the rustling of footsteps above. Samuel was up there, calling out for her, unaware of the man she had dragged into their home. Sarah's pulse hammered in her ears. There was no time to waste. Taza's face was pale, his black hair matted with sweat, his skin burned under her fingers as she pressed her palm against his wound. His eyes flickered open, momentarily meeting hers. His gaze was still sharp, still defiant, and it held her there, like a rope tying her to him. She closed her eyes for a brief second, inhaling deeply. The smell of herbs filled her nostrils, her mother's old remedies, the same herbs she had used to mend the sick and the wounded, to ease the pain of those who had no voice. It was the only thing she could rely on now. "Hold on," she whispered softly, her words more for herself than for him. She grabbed the old leather pouch her mother had left behind and pulled out a small vial of herbs. Her fingers, slick with sweat, fumbled with the cork. The sound of her breath was the only thing that broke the silence. "Just like she taught me," Sarah muttered, her voice steady even though the fear gnawed at her stomach. She crushed the herbs between her fingers and pressed them into the wound, using the cloth her mother had left in the pouch to cover it. The smell of lavender and sage mixed with the blood, filling the air with an odd sense of urgency. She glanced up just as Samuel's voice grew louder, closer now. "Sarah, Sarah, where are you?" His footsteps echoed in the barn. The tension in Sarah's chest tightened, the fear rising. If Samuel saw Taza, there would be no explanation, no escaping the consequences. He would tell Jedediah, and then a shiver ran down her spine. She couldn't let that happen. "Stay still," she whispered urgently to Taza, though she wasn't sure if he heard her. His eyes were closed, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Her hand shook as she removed the bullet with the knife. Her mother's old book of remedies lay open on the ground beside her, but Sarah didn't need it now. She knew what had to be done. With every motion, the world around her seemed to quiet down, as if the barn itself was holding its breath. She pressed her hand to the wound again, holding it together, using all the strength she had left. A bead of sweat trickled down her temple. Time seemed to stretch into eternity. Suddenly, a loud thump echoed from above. Samuel's footsteps stopped. His voice rang out, high-pitched and full of suspicion. "Sarah, what's going on down there?" She froze, holding her breath, praying he wouldn't hear her or come down the stairs. The next few seconds felt like hours, but the barn remained silent. The wind outside howled louder, rattling the roof and pushing the door open just a crack. A sliver of twilight cut through the barn, casting shadows on the dusty floor. Samuel's voice came again, quieter this time, hesitant. "Sarah?" She dared not move, too afraid of the disaster that would unfold if she did. The weight of her decision, of hiding Taza in the first place, pressed on her chest. Was it too late? Was the lie already too deep to undo? She carefully pressed a fresh bandage against Taza's wound, hoping the herbs would help ease the bleeding. His eyes fluttered open again, this time gazing at her through a haze of pain. There was something more in his look now. Gratitude, perhaps, or a quiet acknowledgement of the unspoken bond that had formed between them in these last few minutes. Her heart pounded, but she did not flinch. She had made her choice. The footsteps above finally faded. Sarah breathed a sigh of relief, for now she had time. With all the quiet care she could muster, Sarah worked through the night. The wind outside grew colder, and the stars emerged in the vast desert sky. The barn felt like a sanctuary, temporary, fragile, but still a place of refuge for the time being. Taza remained unconscious for hours, but Sarah stayed by his side. His body burned with fever, but she didn't stop. She had never felt such purpose before, such a raw determination. Just before dawn, Taza stirred. His lips parted, but no sound came out. Sarah leaned closer, her breath catching in her throat. "Taza," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're safe. Just rest." His fingers twitched, as though trying to reach for something. Sarah placed her hand over his, holding him steady. She didn't know what would happen next or how long this fragile peace could last. But for now, in the dimming light of the barn, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps they could survive this. Sarah had just finished tending to Taza when she heard the unmistakable sound of hooves outside, the heavy thudding of horses, and then the sharp voice of Lieutenant Alistair Finch demanding to speak to Jedediah. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. There was no way to hide Taza now. She had no choice but to face her father and the soldiers and the lie she had told. The nights grew heavier after the cavalry's visit. Wind crept beneath the eaves of the barn, moaning through the cracks, while lantern light threw long, restless shadows across the dirt floor. Sarah moved in silence, her skirts brushing the ground as she carried a small bowl of broth down the cellar steps. Each creak of the wood above her felt like thunder, as though the house itself knew the secret she was hiding. Taza sat propped against the wall, his dark hair falling over his shoulders, his chest wrapped tightly in the cloth she had pressed against his wound. His eyes, sharp, watchful, followed her every movement. Though his skin still bore the pallor of fever, there was a stubborn flame there, refusing to die. Sarah lowered the bowl and handed him a spoon. "Eat slowly," she whispered. Her voice was steady, but her hands betrayed her, trembling as they lingered too close to his. He studied her with quiet intensity, then shook his head, pushing the spoon away. Instead, he pressed his palm flat against his chest, then toward her. The gesture was hesitant but deliberate. She frowned, not understanding. He repeated it, slower this time. Then, softly, he spoke. "Taza." The word hung in the cellar, firm despite his weakness. Sarah's lips parted. "Taza," she repeated, the name strange and strong on her tongue. A faint smile touched his lips. He pointed again, first to his chest, then to her. His eyes asked the question his English could not. She hesitated, her heart hammering. Sarah. His voice was low, almost reverent. Sarah. For the first time in weeks, she felt warmth that was not born of fever or lantern flame. It was the warmth of being seen, not as the preacher's daughter, not as a vessel of her father's rules, but as herself. The days slipped into rhythm. At dawn, she worked alongside Jedediah and Samuel in the fields, her face composed, her words obedient. But at dusk, when the others slept, she stole away to the barn. Down in the shadows, she found a world that belonged only to her and the wounded warrior she risked everything to protect. Taza taught her words in Apache, syllables that rolled off his tongue like the rush of water over stone. She repeated them awkwardly, and when she stumbled, his laughter, quiet, restrained, filled the cellar. It was a sound she hadn't heard since her mother's passing, laughter unsharpened by judgment. One night, he reached into the pouch at his side and withdrew something small, a single feather, the color of the blood at sunset. He held it out to her, his hand steady despite the tremor of his body. Sarah stared, breath caught. The feather seemed to glow in the lantern light, a symbol of something vast and dangerous. "What is it?" she whispered. His English was broken, but the word came clear. Hawk. Her throat tightened. She took it gently, the barb soft against her fingers. "Why give it to me?" He touched his chest, then touched hers. His eyes told the rest. Sarah pressed the feather to her heart, overwhelmed by the weight of what it meant. She knew this was no simple token. It was a vow, as sacred in his world as the prayers her father thundered from the pulpit. But shadows never remain still. Lieutenant Finch returned a week later, his boots striking the dirt road like hammers, his uniform pressed with self-righteous pride. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with sandy hair combed back in military precision, his blue eyes always scanning, calculating. He carried with him not just authority, but suspicion, a gnawing hunger to prove himself. "Miss Jenkins," he greeted, tipping his hat with a smile that never reached his eyes. "You look pale. I do hope your father isn't working you too hard." Sarah forced a polite nod, her hands hidden in her apron. She could feel his gaze lingering longer than it should, probing. Finch had visited often since that night, always with questions that skirted too close, always with a tone too smooth to trust. Behind his mannered words, she sensed the truth. He doubted her, doubted the family, doubted the silence of the barn. That evening, as storm clouds gathered over the canyon, the air thickened with unease. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and the electric sting of lightning yet to come. Sarah slipped into the cellar with her lantern, but her movements lacked their usual steadiness. She could not shake the image of Finch's sharp eyes. Taza sensed it immediately, his gaze locked on hers, searching. "What, wrong?" he asked in halting English. She shook her head, unwilling to burden him, but her trembling hands betrayed her. Finally she whispered, "They suspect." Taza leaned forward despite the pain that shadowed his face. His hand, rough and warm, brushed against hers. The gesture was simple, but in it lay reassurance. Outside, thunder cracked, rattling the very walls of the barn. Sarah jumped, clutching the feather he had given her as though it might shield her from the storm. Hours later, as rain hammered the roof and lightning split the sky, Sarah heard it, the sound of hooves, not her father's wagon, not the cattle in the field. This was sharper, urgent. She rushed to the barn window, heart thudding. Lanterns bobbed in the darkness, their glow distorted by sheets of rain. Riders, dozens of them. Her breath caught. Among the soldiers rode a man unlike the others, an Apache scout, his figure draped in a sodden blanket, hair slicked to his face. His sharp eyes scanned the landscape with predator's precision. They were coming straight for the barn. Sarah's pulse roared in her ears. The storm outside mirrored the storm inside her. Fear, desperation, the wild thrum of a choice closing in. She darted down the cellar steps, words tumbling from her lips. "Taza, you mustn't make a sound. They're here. They're coming." He reached for her hand, gripping it tightly. In his eyes, there was no fear, only resolve. The storm above grew louder, wind screaming through the rafters as boots splashed through the mud outside. A soldier's voice cut through the rain. "Search the barn!" The door groaned open. Lantern light spilled across the hay. Shadows lengthened. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. They were seconds away from the cellar door. The storm pressed its weight against the barn like a living thing. Rain hammered the roof in deafening sheets. The wind rattled the boards, and lightning clawed across the sky with white fire. The soldiers' lanterns glowed through the cracks in the wood, beams of light slicing through the darkness like knives. Boots thudded against wet earth, voices barked orders, and Sarah felt her throat tighten until she could scarcely breathe. She clutched Taza's arm, guiding him toward the back wall of the cellar. Her lantern flickered violently, its flame nearly smothered by the damp air. "This way," she whispered, her voice drowned by thunder. "There's a passage." Taza's eyes burned with urgency, but not fear. He followed, limping, his breath sharp from the pain still buried in his chest. Together they pressed against the rotting boards of the far wall. Sarah shoved with all her strength, the wood groaning before finally giving way to reveal the dark, narrow mouth of a hidden tunnel. The air inside was cold, damp, and thick with earth. It smelled of soil and forgotten time. Her mother had once spoken of this tunnel, a storm shelter built in secret years ago. Sarah never thought she would use it. Now it was the only chance to keep him alive. Above them, heavy boots stomped across the barn floor. Samuel's small voice echoed faintly, startled and confused as if caught in the soldier's path. Sarah froze, heart pounding, terrified they would frighten him into speaking words that could undo everything. "Go!" she hissed, pushing Taza gently toward the tunnel. But Taza paused. In the faint light, he pressed something into her palm. A second feather, hawk's red plume, vivid even in the storm's shadow. His gaze locked on hers, fierce and unyielding, as though carving the vow into her very skin. Her lips trembled. She wanted to speak, to beg him not to leave, to promise that she would find him again. But the words died in her throat. "Sarah," he whispered, her name raw and reverent. Then he slipped into the darkness of the tunnel, swallowed by the storm's howl. The moment he vanished, soldiers burst into the barn above. The cellar door creaked under the weight of boots. Sarah's lantern sputtered and died, plunging her into near blackness. She pressed herself against the damp wall, dirt cold against her cheek, her hand still clutching the feather. "Check every corner!" Finch's voice boomed, sharp and commanding. Lieutenant Alistair Finch cut an imposing figure as he strode across the barn, lantern in hand. His wet uniform clung to his tall frame, his sandy hair plastered to his forehead. The storm made his pale blue eyes glitter with a dangerous light. He was 30, proud and hungry for recognition, every gesture calculated, every word sharpened to pierce. Sarah held her breath as beams of light swept across the cellar. Shadows danced wildly. The soldiers searched hay, crates, and walls, their rifles catching brief flashes of lightning from outside. Then, a miracle. The rain intensified, a furious downpour that turned soil into rivers of mud. Tracks disappeared, hoofprints melted into the flood, and the wind shoved soldiers sideways, forcing them to shield their faces with their hands. "Lieutenant," one of them shouted over the storm, "the trail's gone! We can't see a damn thing!" Finch cursed, slamming his fist against a wooden post. His lantern swung violently, scattering wild light across Sarah's hiding place. For one terrifying instant, she thought the glow had caught the tunnel's outline, but another crash of thunder shook the barn, dust falling from the rafters, and the soldiers stumbled back. "Fall back for now," Finch barked, voice tight with fury. "But this isn't over." His boots struck the boards in sharp, deliberate rhythm as he left, each step promising return. When the sound of hooves finally faded into the storm, Sarah collapsed to her knees. Her body shook, her breath ragged. She pressed the feather to her lips, its damp barbs trembling against her skin. It carried the warmth of his hand, the weight of a vow. The barn felt emptier than ever, its walls groaning under the storm's rage. For the first time since her mother's death, Sarah wept, not the quiet tears of restraint, but a flood, fierce and unstoppable. She wept for the danger, for the lies piling upon each other, for the knowledge that each breath she drew carried her deeper into a choice she could not undo. Through the floorboards she heard Samuel's voice calling for her. He was frightened, confused by the soldier's presence. She wiped her eyes, forced herself to stand, and climbed from the cellar. Samuel stood by the door, his small frame lit by a flash of lightning. His face was pale, his blonde hair plastered wet against his forehead. He clutched a wooden toy horse in his hand, a comfort against the storm. "Sarah," he whispered, eyes wide. Why were they here? Why did they look in the barn? Her chest ached. She wanted to pull him close, tell him everything, beg him to keep her secret. But the weight of it was too much for a child. Instead, she knelt and brushed a strand of wet hair from his face. "They didn't find anything," she said softly. "That's all that matters." But Samuel looked at her differently now, eyes too sharp, too knowing for his age. The storm had not only torn through the land, it had shaken the fragile fabric of trust within their home. By morning, the rain had softened to drizzle. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, clean but heavy. The land bore no trace of what had passed, the hoofprints, the blood, the desperate struggle, all washed away as though the storm itself had conspired to guard her secret. Yet inside Sarah, the secret grew heavier. Finch's voice still rang in her mind. "This isn't over." At breakfast, Jedediah bowed his head in prayer, his voice stern and commanding even before God. Samuel sat silent, eyes fixed on Sarah, as if searching for cracks in her mask. And Sarah, her hands folded tightly in her lap, felt the red feather hidden beneath her dress, its point pressing against her ribs with every breath. Outside the window, Finch sat astride his horse in the gray drizzle, his gaze fixed on the Jenkins homestead. His jaw was tight, his eyes narrowed. He tipped his hat to Jedediah with feigned respect, but his stare lingered on Sarah, sharp as a blade. He would be back. And Sarah knew her secret was no longer safe. The land had turned green again. Spring spread its fingers across the canyon, coaxing wildflowers from the earth and softening the edges of winter's scars. But in Sarah's heart, there was no ease. The sunlit mornings rang with the sound of birds, the bleating of lambs, the steady clink of her father's tools. Yet all she felt was the quiet weight of absence, the memory of a man who had vanished into storm and shadow. Lieutenant Finch had not vanished. He came often now, his horse's hooves crunching on the gravel path, his polished boots striking the porch as though each visit was a claim. He carried with him the air of a man assured of his victory, confident, relentless, charming when it suited him. At 29, with sandy hair kept meticulously in order and pale eyes sharpened by ambition, he embodied everything Jedediah admired: discipline, God-fearing authority, and the promise of safety. One evening, as the sky deepened into violet and the cicadas sang from the cottonwoods, Finch arrived with a bouquet of prairie roses in his hand. He bowed his head to Jedediah, then turned to Sarah with a smile that felt like a blade she could not dodge. "Miss Jenkins," he said warmly. "A flower for a flower. It seems right, does it not?" Sarah forced her lips into a polite curve. The petals smelled sweet, but in her hands they felt heavy, like chains. Jedediah, his gray beard bristling, clasped Finch's shoulder. "The Lord blesses a man who pursues with steadfastness. My Sarah will see sense in time. She only needs patience." Sarah looked away, her throat tightening. She could not tell her father the truth, that her heart had already been claimed, not by safety, but by fire. The days grew restless. Samuel lingered near her more often, his young eyes sharp with unspoken questions. Once, when she sat alone by the well, fingering the red hawk's feather hidden in her apron, Samuel approached quietly. "You still think about him," he said, his voice not accusing but trembling with fear. Sarah stiffened, the feather nearly slipping from her hand. "Don't speak of things you don't understand." But Samuel's gaze, earnest, too old for 12, held hers. "I understand enough. If Father or Finch ever finds out," his voice cracked, "it'll ruin us." Her hand trembled as she cupped his cheek. "Then you mustn't ever tell. Promise me, Samuel, promise." The boy swallowed hard, then nodded, though tears shone in his eyes. The town's air thickened with rumor as April turned to May. Travelers spoke of renewed clashes in the south. They whispered of an Apache leader unlike any before, fierce, cunning, swift as the hawk whose feather he bore. His warriors followed him without hesitation, and even the cavalry muttered his name with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. Sarah's heart clenched when she overheard two ranchers at the mercantile. They say he wears a feather, red as blood, one muttered. And that he never backs down, the other replied grimly. Calls himself Taza. The room spun around her. She clutched the counter to steady herself, her breath ragged. Taza was alive, not only alive, but risen into legend. That night, as rain pattered gently on the roof, she lay awake staring at the rafters. The feather he had given her lay against her chest. The thought of him, somewhere beyond the horizon, leading men into battle, burned both pride and terror into her heart. She loved him for his fire, yet trembled at what that fire might consume. Finch grew bolder with every visit. He spoke not only of courtship, but of marriage, his words edged with authority more than affection. You need a man who can protect you, he told her one afternoon, his boots muddy from drilling soldiers nearby. These savages, he spat the word with disdain, understand only force, and force is what I am trained to deliver. You'd do well to join yourself to it. Sarah's stomach turned. They're not all savages, she said softly, unable to hold the words back. His pale eyes narrowed. I pray you don't mean what I think you mean. Jedediah entered then, breaking the tension with a booming voice of approval. Lieutenant Finch speaks truth. Our people must be strong. Sarah, child, do not let sentiment blind you. Sarah lowered her gaze, but inside she was screaming. The room smelled of oil lamps and dust, but beneath it all she smelled smoke, felt the shadow of fire. She remembered Taza's eyes, how they had burned not with cruelty but with pride, with something human her father refused to see. The land held its breath as May arrived. The wind shifted, hot and dry, carrying with it a sense of reckoning. Sarah walked the pasture one dawn, the dew wetting her hem when she saw them. Dark shapes crested the ridge, dozens, then scores, until the entire hillside seemed alive. Apache riders, their horses glistening in the early light, lances and bows rising like forest branches in motion. At their head rode a figure she knew before her heart dared believe it. Taza. He sat tall, the red feather bound in his hair catching the sun like fire. His face bore new scars, his shoulders carried the weight of leadership, but his eyes, those unyielding eyes, were the same. Sarah's breath caught. Every step she had taken since that storm, every lie she had told, every fear she had buried, had led to this moment. The riders halted, their presence a living wall of power and silence. Even the earth seemed to tremble beneath them. Behind Sarah, the farmhouse door slammed open. Jedediah strode out, Finch at his side, Samuel clutching the frame with wide eyes. The two worlds Sarah had tried to keep apart had collided on her very doorstep. Taza, now a chief, sat astride his horse at the head of the Apache riders, staring down at the Jenkins homestead. Sarah stood frozen between her father and Finch, her chest heaving with dread and longing. The air was thick with the promise of blood, or the chance of something greater. The morning air was unnaturally still. Not a single bird called from the cottonwoods, not a single breeze stirred the wheat in the Jenkins field. It was the kind of silence that presses against the skin, warning of something vast approaching. Sarah stood at the porch, her heart drumming, her eyes fixed on the ridge where the Apache riders had gathered like storm clouds given flesh. At their head, Taza sat astride a coal-black stallion, the red hawk's feather braided into his long, dark hair. He had changed since the night she last saw him vanish into the rain. Broader now, the harsh sun had carved lines of resolve into his face, but his eyes, those eyes, still burned with the same fire, fierce yet impossibly human. Behind him, warriors fanned out in ranks, their spears glinting in the morning light, horses restless and stamping. On the opposite side, Lieutenant Finch barked orders, his company of cavalry forming tight lines, rifles raised, bayonets catching the sun like fangs. Dust curled in the air, thick and hot, while Jedediah's voice, booming and righteous, cut through the tension. "You will not step foot closer," the old preacher roared, gripping his Bible in one hand and Sarah's shoulder in the other, as though she were a possession he could anchor by force of will. His eyes gleamed with defiance. "I would sooner see my daughter in the grave than in the arms of a heathen." Sarah flinched, her chest heaving. Samuel clung to the doorway, wide-eyed and pale, too young to carry the weight of what was about to unfold, yet forced to bear witness. Taza nudged his horse forward, slow and deliberate. The earth seemed to tremble beneath each step. When he stopped before the porch, he raised his voice, deep, resonant, unyielding. "I do not come for war," he declared, his gaze locked on Sarah. "I come for her, for Sarah Jenkins." The world seemed to hold its breath. He lifted a hand, and behind him, two warriors led forth a small herd of mustangs, sleek, strong, coats gleaming like bronze in the light. Their hooves struck the earth in restless rhythm, manes tossing, eyes bright with untamed spirit. "My gift," Taza said, his words slow but clear. "A herd of horses, the finest of my people, not stolen, not taken by force, offered as dowry, as respect. I ask not for conquest, but for marriage." A ripple spread through the gathered men. Even the cavalry wavered, glancing at one another. Jedediah, however, stiffened, his face mottled with fury. "Blasphemy!" he thundered. "You dare mock God's law with this pagan custom? I tell you, I will die before my blood mingles with yours." Finch's jaw tightened. He raised his hand toward his men. "Enough of this charade. Ready arms." Sarah's breath caught. The cavalry shifted, rifles lifting, the metallic click of hammers being drawn back shattering the silence. The Apache warriors tensed, bows raised, spears angled. Horses snorted and pawed the earth, sensing the edge of slaughter. "Stop!" Sarah's voice cracked the air like a whip. Every head turned. She stepped forward, out from the shadow of her father's grip, her skirt brushing the dust, her eyes burning not with fear but with clarity. For a heartbeat she was silent. The whole world balanced on her breath. Then, steady and fierce, she spoke. "You speak of God, Father, but what of his command to love, to show mercy? You speak of protection, Lieutenant Finch, but your protection is built on hatred and death. I cannot—" Her voice trembled, then steadied. "I will not choose fear." Jedediah's face blanched, disbelief turning to rage. Finch's hand hovered, trembling between command and restraint. Sarah took another step forward, then another, until she stood on the edge of the porch facing both armies, her heart hammering like a drum. She looked to Taza. His eyes met hers, steady, waiting, not demanding, not pleading, but offering. With a breath that seemed to tear her free from years of chains, she descended the steps. The boards groaned under her feet, dust rising with each stride. She walked through the charged air, her dress fluttering in the heated wind, and when she reached him, she placed her hand into his. The world seemed to exhale. Finch's arm shook, fury twisting his face. "She is bewitched," he spat. "This cannot stand. Fire!" But his order never landed, because at that moment Samuel broke from the doorway, his small voice shrill and shaking. "Stop! She's my sister. She belongs to herself, not to you." The words, innocent and unrefined, struck harder than any sermon. A murmur ran through the cavalry. Some lowered their rifles. The Apache warriors, eyes bright, eased their bows. Jedediah swayed as if struck, his Bible slipping from his grip into the dust. His lips moved, but no sound came. Taza raised Sarah's hand high, his voice ringing out like thunder. "No more blood today. Let this stand as peace. Her choice is made." Silence fell, vast and fragile. Then, slowly, like a tide withdrawing, the threat receded. Rifles lowered, spears dipped, horses stilled. Sarah turned once to look back. Her father stood frozen, a broken statue of pride and fury. Finch's eyes burned with humiliation, but even he dared not defy the moment. Samuel's face shone with tears, but in his eyes there was something new, relief. She squeezed Taza's hand. Together they turned from the porch, from the house, from the life that had caged her in fear. The Apache riders parted, creating a path. As she walked beside Taza, the herd of mustangs thundered forward, their hooves shaking the ground, a living dowry of freedom. Dust rose around them, golden in the sunlight, swirling like a curtain drawn across the past. For Sarah, it was not just an ending, it was a beginning. As the riders moved into the distance, Sarah glanced back once more. The farmhouse shrank against the vast sky, a relic of chains she had cast off. Ahead stretched the canyon, wild and immense, the wind rushing like a hymn of liberation. She lifted her face to the sun, the red feather glinting at Taza's side. For the first time, she felt no fear. Only freedom, only love. Sometimes the hardest road is not the one carved through stone or shadow, but the one that asks us to choose love over fear. Sarah's journey reminds us that freedom is found in the courage to step away from hate, to hold fast to compassion, and to trust the hand that reaches for ours, even when the world stands against it. Her choice was not only about love for Taza, it was about believing that peace can be stronger than war, and that the heart, once set free, can guide us all toward a brighter tomorrow. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from tonight? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if this story touched your heart, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next tale we bring to life. Until then, may your days be filled with warmth, hope, and the quiet courage to choose love when it matters most.